This program contains material and topics that may not be suitable for younger audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Coming out. Thank you. For this afternoon's conversation, Censorship in Cinema, we're very excited again to be partnering with the Sarasota Opera on this program. As you may know, this season the Sarasota Opera Company did a production of Robert Ward's opera of The Crucible. And we took that as an inspiration for our partnership this year and put together a series of films that we're playing during the festival, and now this conversation is sort of the culmination of that partnership. And again, opening night at the Opera House, our tribute at the Opera House. This conversation, our conversation with Christopher Plummer here today, it's been an amazing partnership, and we're so grateful to the staff and the volunteers here at the Sarasota Opera for all that they do for us. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you to them. Before I introduce Julie Makowski from the opera to say a few words, I did want to thank the festival sponsors, the Amicus Foundation, the Familio Family Foundation, the Regal Entertainment Group, Wild Lexus, who have been the engine of the festival, really getting all of our guests around town. As I said earlier, it is like a military operation, moving this many people around, and we couldn't do it without their support. So thank you to Wild Lexus. I also want to thank Sarasota Magazine, our friends, again, at Home Resource, who have provided the furniture for the event. They've been really tremendous to us as well. So thank you to all of our sponsors. We are a nonprofit arts organization here in Sarasota. We could not do this without their sponsorship, so thank you to them. I want to thank all of our festival volunteers as well for their contribution to the festival and making it happen. So thank you to our volunteers as well. And it is my pleasure now to introduce you to Julie Makowski here from the Sarasota Opera to say a few words about our partnership as well. Julie.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom said, when Sarasota Opera decided to present the American Classic series and started with the piece The Crucible that we did on this season, Susan Danis, our brilliant executive director, had the foresight to say that we needed to do some education events surrounding this new series so that people could get familiar with the topic and also with the piece. And so we reached out to some really wonderful organizations in town and put together a series of events surrounding The Crucible. And this is, of course, the last of those events. And we were very lucky that everybody that we reached out to partner with was so receptive, and the partnerships have been excellent, none more so than our partnership with the film festival. So thank you to Tom for that. And of course, none of this would have been possible if we had not received a really lovely grant from the Gulf Coast Community Foundation of Venice. And so we owe special thanks to Scott Anderson and Terry Hansen at the Gulf Coast Community Foundation. So, they weren't able to be here, but let's give them a hand in appreciation. So we're looking forward to many, many future adventures with the film festival. Now that we've got this started, I don't think we can be stopped. So thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator for this conversation. He's been on our jury this week, on our Independent Visions jury, and we're so honored that he came down and made the trip to Sarasota. Mr. David Fear, the film editor for Time Out New York, who will be leading our conversation. David.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our panel today. Censorship and Cinema, the Personal Price of Politics. I'm your host and moderator, David Fear, film editor of Time Out New York Magazine. And let me introduce your esteemed panel today. First we have Alex Ross, music critic for The New Yorker and the author of The Rest is Noise, which has been called a fascinating survey of cacophony of the 20th century. And an anthology of his writing from The New Yorker. Listen to this. Filmmaker Joshua Marston, who is the director of Maria Full of Grace, and yes, clap. It's a good one. And a new film called The Forgiveness of Blood, which just premiered at the Berlin Film Festival. We've got filmmaker Peter Askin. He is the director of Trumbo, a documentary on the blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo. And finally, Reed Roosevelt. He is a film publicist and essayist who recently wrote about Elia Kazan on his blog, My Life is a Blog. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for being here. This panel is being held in conjunction not only with the production of The Crucible, Peter Ward's opera on the Arthur Miller play that's playing here right now, but also in conjunction with a sidebar of films that the Sarasota Film Festival has put together. You guys may have seen them during the week. It's The Salt of the Earth. It was made by a member of the Hollywood 10, Herbert Biberman. It's one of the few films to be banned in the United States for political content. They've also shown Trumbo, the documentary on Dalton Trumbo. They showed The Front, Martin Ritt's dramatization of what blacklisted writers had to go through to get their work out there, and Offsides, which is a wonderful Iranian film by a filmmaker named Jafar Panahi, who, it's the last film he made before he was imprisoned by the Iranian government for taking part in some pro-democracy protests. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. But let's get started with the blacklist. The fact that we still use the term the blacklist and terms like McCarthyism are still being bandied about means that even though this event happened decades ago, it's still very much a part of the zeitgeist and still very much a part of our cultural legacy. I'm curious, to the panel, what do you think the legacy of the blacklist is in 2011? Anyone is encouraged to start.
I think things, is this working? Can you hear me? I think things haven't really changed that much. Because when you look at the congressional hearings, like the Dyes Commission and, with the WPA and stuff, the same kind of thing goes on right now. The grant, you see it in the Peter King investigation. It really begins with a congressman stirring up hysteria in order to get attention and publicity and publicize himself. And the same playbook goes on right now.
True, although Peter King, you're referring to the mosque near the World Trade Center. Would that be considered a protest against something artistic, or would it? I mean, my question, I guess, I was thinking back when after 9/11 happened, and Ari Fleischer said, we have to be careful what we say and the remarks that we make. And then Bill Maher got fired from Politically Incorrect very soon after that. And then a year later, he had a TV show. Or you talk about the Dixie Chicks. They were banned by Nashville radio because they'd made some anti-Bush remarks, and then they still got to put an album out, and they still got to tour, and they met with protests.
Well, hello? Am I? Okay. I can tell you, with respect to my experience on Trumbo, because I was involved with that material pre-9/11, when I was first given a version of it to do on stage as a play. Mm-hmm. At that time, that was pre-9/11 and pre-John Ashcroft. And in the time after 9/11, when we rehearsed it as a play, Tim Robbins' film was pulled. Chris Cooper was pulled from a screening at Cooperstown. Chris Cooper, who did it on stage, made John Ashcroft's list. The Dixie Chicks, obviously, in that incident, their album was banned after they talked about being ashamed of being from Texas, and that was in the year 2003, 2004. Mm-hmm. So that's certainly that legacy, or the fact that the blacklist is still with us in one form or another. You just don't need a committee necessarily. You can do something, you can blacklist. And economics was a big part of the punishment from the blacklist. But you can ban things electronically. You can organize a protest across the world, in a day. So, right. It certainly continues.
Listening to what both of you are saying, it certainly makes it clear that the legacy of the blacklist is with us. But I think it's a provocative statement, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the statement that it's the same as it was back then. I don't think that's what you're trying to say necessarily directly, literally, but what's interesting when you reference the Dixie Chicks, and I'm thinking of also, I think it was Juan Williams, or you talk about Bill Maher, and I think, was it Juan Williams that was just fired from NPR for making a political statement? One of the legacies that comes to mind for me is that there is this expectation of artists, particularly artists who are in a domain that's very commercial, whether it's, you know, big bucks pop music or film or actors, to be apolitical, to not have a political opinion, to not express something that they believe in strongly, for fear of alienating an audience. And certainly a corporation always has the fear that some member, some portion of their revenue stream is going to take issue with the thoughts of the artist and thus diminish the sales that they're going to make. And so I think a lot of times what's happening is that there is a real fear of corporations. It may be, you know, places, a company like Clear Channel or Fox News, or, you know, you can associate them with Rupert Murdoch and know that that person has a certain political bias or a little political leaning, but publicly I think there is the intention of presenting oneself as being apolitical, as not wanting to step on any toes, as not wanting to alienate any potential viewers or consumers of the media. And
there's a bottom line to be protected.
Right, and in a sad way, I think one of the legacies of the Blacklist is that the arts and film today is less political now than it once was, even as recently as the 70s, which was still after the Blacklist. But I tried to get a movie made that had to do with the Iraq War, and we had a lot of conversation about Sean Penn and whether or not to offer the role to Sean Penn. And there was a real concern that his politics was going to in some way cast the entire film as being anti-war. And that was, I was personally against the war, but there was this notion that you couldn't say that you were against the war, and you couldn't make a film that was against the war because no one would finance a film that was against the war because it would be considered a propaganda piece. And the film was in no way a propaganda piece. But the interesting thing is that Sean Penn is the exception to the rule of an artist who speaks out and has a strong political view, and as such, carries baggage.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point, which I ran into a little bit on Trumbo, because the material of the letters is very attractive to actors because they're so actable. Mm-hmm. They don't get material like that very often. But there was some pressure in terms of choosing actors for the movie who hadn't been already seen as having political or liberal leanings.
So you're sort of stacking the leftist deck.
Exactly. Right. Preaching, and because the producer wanted to attract a wider audience, so they didn't want to just simply preach to the choir. And there was that pressure.
Sure. Now, Alex, in terms of, let's say, classical music today, do you feel that there's more of a willingness to go to political areas or use music as a form of political expression because there isn't a bottom line the way there is with, say, a Hollywood blockbuster for $80 million or an independent film that's, $1 million that needs to get distribution?
That's an interesting question. And you'd think that would be the case, but actually in classical music, there's been a long-standing fear of getting too deep into politics, and I think it's something embedded in the culture of classical music and how people are taught it in conservatory, and also how people absorb it growing up as they listen to it, which is that classical music is this sublime form of expression far above the daily world and the political world, a refuge from that world, a form of expression, very pure, it sort of refers only to itself in this sort of sublime, transcendent, elusive language. And so, along with that really goes a reluctance to dive into politics. But of course, there are many hundreds, thousands of counterexamples in musical history. And in 20th century music, you have a great many furiously political composers, Kurt Weill, Hans Eisler, Aaron Copland at certain
Sure.
moments, Luigi Nono,
Right.
a great many contemporary European
Leonard
composers.
Bernstein. Leonard
Yeah, of
Bernstein
course,
was a film
Bernstein.
composer in addition to having a foot in the classical world, and was called before the committee. And I believe
Bernstein wasn't called before. Copeland was called before the McCarthy committee. Yeah.
but Bernstein was he was affiliated, wasn't he? Or
Yeah,
he was
Bernstein
accused?
went through a period in the 1950s where he was suspect,
Right.
and actually was. Barry Seldes, who wrote a very interesting book recently about Bernstein's politics, says that Bernstein was effectively blacklisted. He did not appear on the CBS network for a number of years. He was not conducting regular season performances with the New York Philharmonic after, of course, having made this sensational debut. The Philharmonic is a very young man and was seen as the great up-and-comer. And then he did disappear for a little while in terms of his conducting career, at least in America, and the sense, there's not a real smoking gun there, but the sense is that he was seen as untouchable, as untrustworthy politically because of his many affiliations. Ironically, I think this turns out to have been a boon for posterity because in the 50s, this was the period in which he composed much more than he had before and more than he was able to do after his conducting career resumed. And this is the period where he wrote Candide and West Side Story and so many other great pieces.
I'm not as versed in this history, but I'm struck as you're saying this. When these composers were put on the blacklist, what was the argument? Was the argument that by listening to the music, you would somehow be pulled over to the devilish, nefarious left-wing point of view? Because that's clearly what the argument was with film. There was this great fear, right, that you would somehow be taking in a left-wing view and you would walk out a different person. And there was...
That melody is socialist.
Yeah.
Those notes are communist.
Well, with Bernstein in that period, it was just more about the name, and here was a man who had attained considerable degree of celebrity even as a very young man. He had these affiliations, and it was just not the particular name that we want to be associated, along with so many other names. He was just on the list, with hundreds of other names, and was just avoided because there was no specific theory, I think, as far as I know, about music's power to cause trouble. But curiously, I mean, there was this later incident with Bernstein and Nixon, where when Bernstein's Mass was performed at the Kennedy Center, Nixon became very suspicious of it, and the people around
I'm sorry,
him.
Nixon suspicious?
Yes, believe it or not.
Making sure we're on the same page.
And other people around him were saying, this is a trap. Bernstein wants to lure you to this performance, because the Kennedy Center is the monument to the assassinated president, and Nixon was expected to attend, and it's a trap. He's going to spring this anti-war stuff on you, this radical hippie stuff. You actually can go on the internet, on my site, therestisnoise.com. I put together a little audio compilation of really a good 10 or 15 minutes of Nixon at various times talking about Bernstein, talking about classical music, about the programming at the Kennedy Center, and the Bernstein received the great honor at one point of being called "son of a bitch" by Nixon.
It's an uncanny Nixon impersonation.
So he managed to get out of it. He did not go to Mass, and he went to the National Symphony performance instead. But
now you were talking.
But this was all. By this time, there's no longer any sense, as there was in the McCarthy period, that Bernstein's career would be curtailed or that he would be stopped in some way. I mean, Bernstein was famous, and he was more or less untouchable. And the FBI, this was getting past the period when the FBI was really able to destroy people's lives, although certainly that could still happen.
Although we're talking about the early 70s, and the early 70s is when Dalton Trumbo makes Johnny Get His Gun. It's just amazing anti-war film. Now, did he attract controversy for doing this? He obviously, even though he had been persecuted for his political beliefs.
When he made the film?
When he made the film, yes.
Right. I don't know by that time how much. I'm sure it attracted some controversy, but it was not a successful release in this country. I mean, his book, which was written much earlier, was the aspect that attracted a lot of controversy, and especially at the beginning of World War II, when he, and I think you can talk about this some more, but Trumbo at that time had his book pulled off sales because he didn't want to be seen as not being in favor of the Second World War, unlike the First World War, which he was very much opposed to. So that attracted a lot of controversy at that time, but I don't recall that the film itself sparked a wide controversy.
Well, I mean, the 70s were a time when a lot of the blacklisted writers did very well. Waldo Salt was blacklisted, and he wrote the script for Midnight Cowboy. So it wasn't a time at all when I think that I think at that point all was forgiven and they could work, and all kinds of great films were able to be made at that time. You know, the question about the blacklist and what resonance it has for today. I mean, there is no blacklist. You know, there is nothing where you can say something and you're never going to work again for 10 years. There's something that extreme, but there are all different kinds of censorship. And Josh spoke very well about one kind of censorship, which is that they won't let you make the film, which is, you know, censorship can be defined in all kinds of ways, and that's a kind of economic censorship, you know, and it's when you censor, you can be censoring yourself, and there can be religious censorship, when there's things that, you know, are going to offend a religious group, various you know, what happened with that Kennedy show, there was a powerful interest that said that can't be shown because the people who did, you know, that was a very powerful family. You can go on and on about things that I've been consulting, or I talked to some British producers who have a film called The Promise, which won prizes all over the place and is a huge success all over Europe. But it is about the British in Israel in '48. It's a very, very complex issue, and you know, and Julian Schnabel just made a film from a Palestinian woman. It's you know, it's a nuclear bomb. It's not explosive. They cannot get it shown on any American TV channel because they're afraid of what the response might be from Jewish groups. And it's a certain kind of, you can't win. When there's certain topics that are just, you can't, there's nothing you can say about them that won't get some people really upset.
So there's a sort of inbred sense of self-censorship that sort of takes precedence, precedence might be the wrong word, but that is sort of, it kicks into gear before the government maybe has a chance to come in and say, like, you can't say this is politically verboten.
Yeah, but censorship isn't just government, so.
Yeah, and the government, I think we're also talking in terms of the blacklist period versus now. I mean, this was a period in which the government was so much more powerful as a cultural force. I think it's just, you know, you can have sort of people in Congress standing up and waving some kind of, you know, literature and railing about it, but the idea that you know, the House of Representatives or that the Senate would launch an entire investigation of a cultural field of this magnitude
is very imaginable.
Sorry?
I would say it's very imaginable. I would say did it not happen with Tipper Gore and the music industry recently, relatively recently?
Well, I mean, in terms of, you know, American politics and these sort of moral, you know, quote-unquote moral issues, of course, that's much more of a...
Did HUAC not pass itself off as protecting the moral sanctity and the spirit of the American people? It was trying to safeguard and make sure that the young minds were not deformed.
Right, un-American activities. It was the House Committee on Un-American Activities.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, it's not unimaginable, but I guess what I'm saying, the point that I'm getting toward is much more toward what you were saying a little while ago, is that the government is simply not as central, as potent in cultural terms, and the corporations are much more powerful. And this, even before it gets to the point where politicians could even start to look at it. There's the self-censorship that takes place when people are saying, well, we better not get into this, we might have some trouble selling it. And if they do go ahead and make the project, then the company steps in and says, well, I think you better make some changes because we're not, and then stage after stage of that tends to sort of winnow away.
Which is, in many ways, is much more insidious. And I can tell you as an artist, as a filmmaker, it's awful to, when you turn on your computer and you stare at the blank page and you think about what project you're going to write, to come off of experiences of not having been able to get something made precisely because it wasn't viewed commercially viable. And that may or may not relate to the politics of the project, but regardless, there is a censorship that goes on, and it is a commercial censorship.
Now, do you think this extends to documentaries as well, or are we just talking about narrative features?
No, I think the economic pressures of commercial viability certainly extends beyond documentaries. I mean, it's true in narrative features as well, I think. I was just going to say something a little bit different about about the difference between the Blacklist in the 40s and what we experienced today. One of the things that galvanized the politicians and the country during the Blacklist was the threat of nuclear war. We had an identifiable enemy during that Cold War that if we were going to be threatened, it was going to be from Russia. And clearly today, nuclear threat proliferates everywhere. It's not just one unifying force. So people were frightened into, those who opposed freedom of speech and the people who were on the blacklist were scared. A lot of them were scared into it by the threat of what these people represented.
Yeah. Well, the bugaboo today is terrorism. So Cat Stevens was on a plane, they turned it around and sent it back to England. The idea that the guy who wrote Peace Train was too dangerous to land in America,
It's ridiculous, but you also have to remember he's the gentleman who wrote Peace Train and asked for Salman Rushdie to, be killed in the name of religion.
But it wasn't that scary that I feel we had to turn the entire plane off. I don't think he was a danger to our survival. And I do want to make a point that Blacklist was not a governmental thing. It was done by the industry. It was not done by, there was nothing governmental at all. It was just the industry.
The Screenwriters Guild essentially asked this, I believe it was the Screenwriters Guild, I think it was 1952, asked the studios to voluntarily not hire anybody that wasn't deemed friendly or safe by Congress. And even though for several years prior they were saying there will be no blacklist, there will be no blacklist, the Hollywood 10 had already been sentenced, and they said there will be no blacklist, and then in 52 there's a blacklist.
But hadn't the congressional investigations really created the pressure for those commercial decisions?
Yeah, I believe that right after the Hollywood 10 went to jail, the studio executives in the Waldorf had a press conference saying we're going to have a blacklist. We're not going to hire anybody that we think is a communist. You didn't even have to declare you're a communist. You just had to, somebody could have said it, or they could have smelled it, or whatever. You could be just progressive and be blacklisted.
A lot of the real pressure in the blacklist was, as being said, was economic. Mm-hmm. I mean, and the studios and the producers were also smart businessmen, and they continued to hire a lot of these same blacklisted writers. They just got them for $1,000 a script rather than $50,000 a script.
Hit them where it hurts economically.
And imagine today what that scenario would be. Think about the Woody Allen film. If you were a blacklisted screenwriter and you couldn't get work in the studios, how would you get your work made and how would you get it out? Can anyone say YouTube? I mean, what's interesting to me is that nowadays you could argue that the situation is different, and that the flip side, the bonus side of one of the things we've got now that we didn't have then, is a form of media that would make blacklisting, that would counter blacklisting. Obviously, it's one thing to write a $50 million movie and not be able to get it made, but and it's hard to make a living writing screenplays for movies that are going to get made for no money and distributed on YouTube. But there are probably more ways now for a screenwriter to fight back in terms of having their artistic voice heard than there were back then.
Right, and Salt of the Earth was an independent feature. I mean, it was made outside of the studios. They just weren't able to show it. Whereas now, we've got a number of alternate ways to get that material out there. There still is a difference, obviously, between putting a film up on YouTube or putting a film out in 3,000 theaters with a $20 million marketing campaign, or even just taking it to Sundance and having that name attached to it.
But there is, the market is different. In the same way that the market, the commerce is doing now what the government did then, the market also is much more fractured in a way that it's enabling, you could make the optimist argument that it is also enabling alternative routes that give artists, that make blacklisting, centralized blacklisting less scary or less relevant. I mean, I will say that after watching Trumbo and thinking of what Jafar Panahi is going through now, I feel like all of this is a really facile and luxurious debate to have, because the truth of the matter is that what we have in the United States now is nothing like what's going on in Iran now, or nothing like what was going on in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. You think of Václav Havel in a way, after the Velvet Revolution, lamented the fact that art no longer had this very strong opponent to fight, and that when you had strong censorship and you had the risk of going to prison for saying something explicit, it created all sorts of, Reed and I were talking about this before, that it created all sorts of interesting creative possibilities where simply taking a line of rocks, for example. I remember Havel writing this essay in which you're talking about, you put a line of rocks on stage and you take one rock and you lift it up and you put it 2 feet forward and you put it down. All of this symbolic resonance. And so artists would find other ways to express themselves that had much more political weight.
Yeah, I think the most incredible example is Shostakovich in the Soviet Union. The writers were silenced, the filmmakers were silenced or put under very exacting restrictions. Shostakovich could go on writing symphonies, and no one was able to determine exactly what he was saying in these symphonies, and the premieres of these works were unbelievably intense occasions where essentially so many people in the audience were hearing one message, often a message of lament, of opposition, of anger, whereas a committee of officials had looked at the symphony and seen nothing wrong, even seen it as an affirmation of Stalinist values and that ambiguity in music, total ambiguity of a sort of abstract instrumental piece was something that Shostakovich manipulated brilliantly, and there's many other composers of that period as well.
And I think even more than that, a lot of poetry came out of repressive cultures in Spain under Franco, Carlos Saura's films. They put all these hidden things in, and they had to express themselves in a poetic way because they couldn't express them in a lyrical way. Same thing happened in Brazil, where some of the love songs that are written had tremendous political underpinnings, which they were able to hide under it being a love song, rather than rather being about what it really was about.
Iranian cinema in the last 10, 15 years has done that beautifully. But now we're looking, you brought up Jafar Panahi. Jafar Panahi makes films that aren't explicitly political necessarily. You could make an argument for something like The Circle, but for the most part, his films are much more allegorical. And because he takes part in a pro-democracy protest, he is given a 5-year prison sentence. He's banned from making films for 20 years, and essentially has his foreign travel visa revoked. So is it a particularly volatile time to be an international artist and working with political stuff? Or even be an international artist and be affiliated with politics, even if they're not involved in your art? That's where they're going to hit you in your mode of expression.
The answer is yes, but not in the United States. In other countries, yes, absolutely. Certainly in Iran now, it's much more dangerous.
Well, I do wonder, as writers, as critics, as filmmakers, as documentarians, how do we stop something like this? How do we contribute? Is it just enough to say, like, this is happening, Jafar Panahi has been imprisoned, what can we do about it?
Well, I was recently at the Berlin Film Festival where he was supposed to be on the jury, and they made a big point of positioning an empty chair on stage to mark his absence and his inability to participate in the festival, and it made headline news, and it was an act of solidarity. And I heard, I didn't actually go and confirm it myself, that a German translator who had been working with him was subsequently freed from prison in Iran, as one presumed, as a result of this very dramatic statement, this very dramatic symbolism that happened in the closing ceremonies of the Berlin Film Festival. So, I mean, one important thing is acts of association, between artists across borders, speaking up for one another. I think that becomes very important. And that was very important during the Blacklist, wasn't there? There's a letter of 200 and some people who subsequently came to the defense of people who had been blacklisted, and then they themselves, some of them had trouble because they had signed this letter. But I mean, I think it raises the point that there is a certain responsibility for artists who are working in countries that are more free to come to the defense of artists who are working in other countries where their freedoms are being abrogated.
Yeah, it makes me think of this recent incident in China. Bob Dylan went on a tour in China and was greatly criticized for not having spoken up at some point in his shows about the detention of Ai Weiwei, and also criticized for not having performed certain early 60s protest songs, Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are Changin', which people thought would have somehow sent a very strong message to the Chinese government. My reaction was that, Bob Dylan did what he always did. He did the same set list. There's no evidence that he was censored, that he chose, that he was told not to sing certain songs. It's absurd to imagine him getting up and giving some political speech on stage. It's just not something that he's done in decades. So up to that point, I would defend his behavior and the fact that he did sing, that he appeared at all, and everything that he symbolized may have been some kind of subtler statement, especially to younger people in China, singing songs like "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall." But at the same time, should artists be continuing to tour in China under these circumstances? And it's certainly something for classical music to look at, because classical music is very big business in China, and so far I've heard no one in the classical world raising that question. So everyone's sort of focused on Dylan because he's such a political symbol, or used to be a political symbol, but there's sort of no whisper that I've detected of a parallel discussion in the classical side of things.
The bigger, more powerful thing would be for a company like Disney or any one of the studios to decide that they weren't going to release their movies in China, whether they wouldn't film anything in China. I've heard film companies say that they won't work in China simply because it's too much of a pain, because there's too much, not only censoring, but just government involvement and red tape, and it's very difficult to get permits and things like that. But there is a great sensitivity on the part of the studios to not ruffle any feathers and to make sure that they're not going to, this is a huge market that's being opened up to them, and they don't want to lose that market.
Let's talk about two of the names that are probably most associated with the Blacklist, and that's Trumbo and Kazan. Now, Reed, you recently wrote an essay. You've actually written 2 essays now on your blog about Elia Kazan, and how revisiting some of his films, when a very large DVD set of his work came out, you realized that his work as an artist was significant enough and enough time has passed that people should sort of forgive and forget. Would that be incorrect?
I feel that one can have a more nuanced attitude towards the whole period. And Kazan kind of took me to that because of that question. Should you forgive and forget? Should time, mean that you don't think about these things if he's been an informer, if he's been a rat? And then it made me want to know more.
Right.
And so I learned about what the American Communist Party was actually trying to achieve at the WPA Theater and in Hollywood. And yes, they were trying to influence, you know, they were absolutely trying to influence movies. They weren't succeeding, but that was their goal. And that's one of the ironies of these committees, is that they were trying to get people to admit they were in the Communist Party, but they weren't really curious at all about whether any of these things actually worked.
Right.
But definitely was the goal to get Communist Party line into the group theater's productions. It's a matter of historical record, yes.
But it's interesting to see how it still affects how people think about these two figures today, these two opposite figures. And it's also interesting to say that people probably don't know Trumbo's name as much as they should, I would argue, but everybody knows who Elia Kazan is. And you know, he still attracts controversy. When he had his 1999 honorary Oscar, there were still people that felt like he should not be honored. I will not stand up for him. I will not clap for him. And Trumbo's name was cited amongst these things of like, you know, if Dalton Trumbo was here, he would not stand up and clap. And so I'm just curious as to how the Blacklist has, if we can eventually get past this when we talk about these two figures. If there will come a point, say, 50 to 100 years from now, when we can talk about Dalton Trumbo without talking about the Blacklist, or if we can talk about Elia Kazan without talking about the Blacklist.
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of this being alive. Because when I wrote my blog, somebody who was the daughter of somebody very much involved in the Blacklist took her name off my list. You know, it obviously made her rage that I would say anything at all that might be nuanced about Kazan. And somebody else, because I was sort of, in his eyes, criticizing Kazan, sent me this email that said, you know, who are you to do that? So these things are really wrong. But I think over time, the people who actually lived through the Blacklist and who are the children of the people who have, you know, it becomes history. And it's not that yet, because people are still pretty pissed off about it. And people see Kazan as an incredible villain, and I'm not completely convinced that that's true.
The word informer is such a vitriolic term in our culture. I think in the Jewish tradition it means eating someone else's flesh, or it translates the expression. And I think that in the congressional hearings, I mean, Larry Parks said in one of the early hearings, he said, I will talk about myself, but don't ask me to talk about.
That is not the American way.
Yeah, don't ask me to talk about someone else. But over time, things do become more nuanced, and even Trumbo. He gave an address to the Writers Guild in 1970, which was 10 years after he got his name on the two films in the same year, Exodus and Spartacus. Even then, he changed when he talked to the younger membership of the Writers Guild about the Blacklist. He said, if we look back on those times, or as I look back on those times, there were no heroes or villains, only victims. And that created such outrage among some of his peers, Albert Maltz for one, and engaged in an ongoing letter-writing battle with Trumbo over how he could say such a thing. Trumbo's own family, his son Chris, who died about a month ago, was in the film, advised his father not to give that speech. His wife didn't want him to give that speech. But 10 years had passed, and he had softened and changed, and so time does change. And I think, you know, the idea of looking at that time a little bit more objectively. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't a horrific time in our history, because it was, but there were circumstances, the economic circumstances of it, the political circumstances of it, with the Cold War and the fear among the American people. God knows I'm not defending Congress then or now, but I think it is wise to look at it I mean, Kazan was a great artist.
You know, fear is so powerful a force. It warps everything, and it can turn a democracy into a
Fear.
totalitarian state. Yes, and that was the climate, and a lot of it was politically generated, and sometimes for rather cynical reasons. I think, you know, there's a great market in selling fear, and,
Well, the
and a man like
committee,
McCarthy was just saw this as just this. He ate it up.
I mean, celebrity was alive even then. It was in its infancy, but the congressional members wanted to go to Hollywood and have their pictures taken with these people.
Yeah, but you know, and I think, you know, it's one thing to lose your job, and it's a terrible thing to be banished from entire business. But there's this deeper threat that was created, which is this existential fear of losing your identity as an American. You know, Copeland and Bernstein had great difficulties with their passports, and Bernstein eventually had to write and sign this humiliating, self-abasing 5-page letters and disavowing all of these political affiliations just to get his passport back. He seems to have been briefly for a year or two on the security index, which was the FBI's list of people who were to be detained in a national emergency, and that was a pretty long list, actually. So this kind of thing really gets under people's skin, and it gives certain individuals enormous power, of course, to manipulate such lists, or even to sort of float the threat in a hearing.
We're not really getting into what an evil thing the blacklist was. I mean, people committed suicide, people became alcoholics and slowly killed themselves, marriages were destroyed. This is not just something about not being able to work or losing your identity or something like this. It killed people. And
literally, in some case, John Garfield, Paul Robeson. I mean, these people died prematurely because of the pressure and stress put on them by having to endure this experience.
Yeah, there's a lot of dead bodies, and there's a lot of just destroyed lives and destroyed families from the blacklist. And one thing that intrigues me about this whole story is that after Kazan and Bud Schulberg were extremely friendly witnesses, saying they gave a lot of names to Congress, a year after that, they made On the Waterfront, which was basically a movie that said, sometimes it's good to inform. You know, if you're informing on really, really bad crooks, then informing is good. And Marlon Brando was in it, and Rod Steiger was in it. In fact, gave the performances, some of the performances of their lives.
Music by Leonard Bernstein.
What?
Music by Leonard Bernstein.
There you go. And then when it came time for the Oscar, the honorary Oscar for Kazan, Brando refused to have his video used in the clips, and Steiger spoke out vitriolically about Kazan as a father who had betrayed his parents, his children. And what had happened in between the time they made the movie and the honorary Oscar is they watched their friends' lives destroyed.
Right, and Kazan obviously was not the only person to name names, but it seems like he's the one that people go to. He is the one that really, and I'm not letting him off the hook or demonizing him, but he was the one that was made the scapegoat. And that was he's still the one that is so associated with it to the point where it taints his reputation to this day, even with wonderful work. And the wonderful work that he did after. If he had not been able to work, if he had been banned from working and blacklisted, there's a host of films that we would not have. And then you, of course, think of the films that we would have had if people like, you know, Abraham Polanski or Edric Matrick or Jules Dassin, who'd, you know, if he'd stayed here, or all the people that had been blacklisted were able to work. And it just becomes this sort of balancing of scales after a while.
Oh, when Kazan was at the Group Theater, which is the most important theater I think that's ever been in America, because it's where the whole modern idea of acting was created. That became the method, that became James Dean, Marlon Brando, and so on. And there was a communist cell. He was a very committed communist, Kazan, And they had a meeting, the members of the group theater who were communists, and they said, everything that's done at the group theater is going to be exactly the party line. It's going to be whatever we say, and if we change the party line, then the group theater is going to switch over to that party line. And they said to Kazan that he had to go back and just do that and not mention that there had been any meeting to discuss that. And he refused. They had a trial, and he was condemned vociferously by all of his friends who were there. And they said he should recant. It's very much in the spirit of Stalinism, you know, and that kind of very shrill communism of the time. And he quit, and this was his home. This was like, you know, he came there when he was right out of college, and this was, you know, and so did he hate those people? I would say he did. And when he turned those very same people, gave the names and you know, and informed on him, did he feel good? He felt great, you know, because it wasn't just informing to save his skin. It was also because these people, in his eyes, had destroyed him, and he hated him. And it was, you know, so it's very complicated. We only think of him as an opportunist, as somebody who did it to, but there's, you know, there's that whole episode. They were basically asking him to betray they were very much asking him to betray what the group theater was about, which is, you know, from Strasberg and Harold Clurman, which was that it was not political. It was all about art.
I think in the name of political free speech, if the audience has any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Up front.
Would you please reintroduce the panel so we can remember who we're listening to? And did he have an anti-communist bent, or was it just personal revenge and financial interest?
Kazan?
Yeah, I mean, I can accept if he's an anti-communist.
Oh, no, he was a committed communist, continued to be in the party after he left the group theater.
So he really was a rat.
He was a communist. He quit at the time of the Hitler-Stalin pact. So he didn't quit when he got thrown out of the theater.
I'm going to reintroduce the panel real quick for your request. Alex Ross, Joshua Marston, Peter Askin, and Reed Roosevelt.
No, I mean who they are.
Alex Ross, the music critic for The New Yorker. Joshua Marston, a filmmaker who's done Maria Full of Grace. Peter Askin, the documentarian who did Trumbo, the documentary on Dalton Trumbo. And Reed Roosevelt, who is an essayist and a publicist.
It's interesting that none of you on the panel lived through this time. Might have been a good idea if you had someone who actually lived through that time. When you say some of them were communist, you know, they were following the communist line. I worked for the American Friends Service Committee, and we happened to have the communist line because we believed in peace and we believed in equality of the races. So, I mean, what other kinds of things, you know, that would upset people would
The communist line was that we should not go to war with Germany because there was a German non-aggression pact with Russia, and we were totally against going to war with Germany. When Germany attacked Russia, then let's go to war. That's what I'm talking about.
in the 50s. In the 50s.
What happened in the 50s? I think
The
the
communist line in the 50s was equality of the races, and we should not go to war. I agree with you. We should not have gone into the Korean War. We should not go into all of these other wars in the meantime.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
I'm saying, do you know what the communist line that was so horrible that you're talking about? And, you know, if you didn't live through it, it's hard for you to know what it was like. It was pretty awful.
I would agree. I mean, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like. We were actually discussing this prior to this, how we were like, well, this is, you know, we're dealing with a legacy. We aren't dealing with actually having turned on our TV every day and seen these congressional hearings. But obviously, the legacy is still here, and you don't have to have lived through this period of history to still feel the ramifications of it, or to still look at, you know, what happened over the decades. Go ahead. She had said that we have not touched on anti-Semitism and how there was a very anti-Semitic vibe. Yeah, I'm sorry. She'd said you haven't touched on the how anti-Semitism was very much part and parcel of the McCarthy hearings, and how there were a large number of people who were being blacklisted who were Jewish. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Well, I'll throw in one historical point, which is that there's an evolution that went on with the House Un-American Activities Committee. People tend to forget that it started back in the 30s. There are several different committees that cropped up at different times, and then Martin Dies was sort of the formal leader of the House committee starting in 1938. At that time, it was actually ostensibly devoted to going after fascist and Nazi agents, as well as Soviet, quote-unquote, communist agents as well. Samuel Dickstein was another member of the House who was part of these investigations, and often went after native fascist activities as a way of exposing anti-Semitism. Of course, by the end of the 40s into the 50s, that element had completely vanished, and it was exclusively about exposing communists. And yes, absolutely, there was an element of anti-Semitism, which in McCarthy's case certainly seems to have been a strong personal conviction.
Right, and not just in the congressional hearings. It was obviously very much a part of society in the 50s, and still being dealt with today. Another question in the back.
What is your opinion of the MPAA rating system, and does it represent de facto censorship through its economic influence?
Did everybody hear that question?
No.
The question was, what do we think of the MPAA rating system, and does that constitute self-censorship?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a conversation just yesterday with Asa Jacobs, who has his film here, Terry, and there is a sequence at the end of Terry in which 3 underage characters start drinking alcohol and then take pills and then challenge each other to take off their clothes. And the youngest actor in the scene is a girl, and the actress was 14, and Asa was telling me that he was concerned. I mean, that he didn't show any nudity, and I don't think he intended to show any nudity, but it was clearly on his mind in terms of how he shot it and the way he was going to shoot it and where he was going to put the camera, that he didn't want to suddenly find himself getting an NC-17 or, God forbid, an X, when he was making a heartfelt, honest, and very insightful portrait of what it's like to grow up, and was really capturing something very truthful in that scene. And yet he had felt like he had these eyes over his shoulder. I had a conversation earlier today in talking about this panel with a producer who was describing preparation for a major Hollywood film called The Virginity Hit, in which the producers had to get on the phone with the studio. There was a dedicated studio individual whose job it was to, for each film, think about whether or not, what the rating of the film was likely to get and what the concerns were, and how many times you could say fuck and in what context, and that you can use it once in a non-sexual context, but if you use it twice in a sexual context, then you're going to get an R and you can't get a PG-13. I've heard stories about sex scenes where you have to count the number of thrusts, that if an individual is shown thrusting 3 times, it's going to get an X rating. So don't think that it isn't very concrete and very specific and very arbitrary ultimately, and it's definitely on the minds of filmmakers and, more to the point, studios.
But the background again is to a large extent economic concerns. I mean, PG-13 can reach X number of viewers in theaters, and R rating is that. And then, of course, when you get beyond R.
Right, there's still...
And it can cut both ways, that sometimes you want the R.
Right, right. Exactly. But I think it's PG-13 and R, and then and you're definitely being the designated person at the studio. They're definitely targeting their desired audience with the rating.
Right.
Almost as much as, the...
And I believe there are stipulations in some contracts that say you must deliver an R-rated film. You cannot go beyond this, or else newspapers will not carry it.
Definitely that you cannot, an R or below, definitely I've also seen that, because if you deliver something that is above an R, then you've just completely diminished the possibility of the studio. And it also then, that becomes a break point where the studio can take the film away from you and re-edit it. And I mean, not that they can't do that anyway normally, but it becomes definitely a line in the contract.
And the irony, of course, is that the NC-17 was designed to take away the stigma of an X. The idea that it would actually be giving people more artistic freedom to do films with slightly edgier, slightly more adult content, and it ended up getting the exact same stigma as the X. Newspapers would not carry it, video chain stores would not carry a film with that. And obviously, like you said, it starts hitting an economic bottom line. So you can make the film you'd like, but you need to trim this, and this if we're going to release it or get it marketed.
Which becomes the notion that that the MPAA is not censoring is completely bogus, because what ends up happening is then the studio censors the filmmaker.
Right.
And since the studio is financing the film, then ultimately there's control over the artistic vision.
Also, it costs a lot of money to rate a film. So most independent films go out without a rating because they can't afford it.
Right. And yet there's no stigma for an NR on something, usually. In the front.
I just wanted to know, I'm not sure if I'm correct, that Lee Grant and her daughter, Dinah Manhoff, I thought she had been married to like Dalton Trumbo or one of the blacklisted individuals, and I was wondering if it had an impact on her career. Eventually, I saw her in the late 60s and 70s in movies, but before that, in the 50s and early 60s, did this impact her?
Well, I don't know.
Let me repeat the question just in case somebody didn't hear it. The question was the actress Lee Grant married to Dalton Trumbo or another blacklisted writer, and how did this affect her career, if it did at all?
She definitely was not married to Dalton Trumbo. That I know. Who was it? Okay. Yeah, and I knew she was in that world and knew people who were blacklisted, but I don't know. I imagine her career was affected as well. I don't know her story as. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I wanted to address something that you really haven't addressed about the McCarthy era that was powerful in the movie, in the play, and the opera. And that was the fact that, number one, you had the background of the 30s when people were looking for another kind of government. So it's not surprising that a lot of little people were communists. In the 40s, there was and then the 50s, they came up, there was a fear, there's always a fear in society, and they played on this fear. And the horrible thing about the McCarthy era was that anybody could stand up and give a list of people, and you were blacklisted. You saved your skin by labeling me and him and Harry. And that was the thing that was so scary. Nobody knew what anybody was going to say. I never knew when I went to a meeting, was this going to be something that was videotaped by the FBI? When I went on a Liberty March, was this a communist thing? You didn't know. It was a very scary time. And you missed all that. I mean, now you sort of know, well, you don't really know the rules, how many times you use a bad word there, one breast versus two. And so there's sort of a slippery kind of a code. But it's not one person naming another one. I'm good because you were bad. I saved my skin by naming so unique.
No, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think this is something that I wanted to mention at some point was these enormous cultural changes that took place in the 30s into the 50s. I think it's such a crucial background to all this. The 30s, the period of the New Deal, when America was going very far to the left politically, when it was not at all remarkable to describe yourself as a socialist or dabbling in communism, and you know, the government itself was moving toward a kind of social democracy. And then there was this very crucial moment, the congressional elections of 1938, which changed everything. And a coalition of Republicans and conservative Democrats were able to gain a majority and start to roll back the New Deal. And Martin Dies, the head of that committee, was playing a crucial role because these arts projects, the Federal Theater Project, it was such a juicy target. You know, it was just so easy to sort of single out some extreme line in a play and then to paint the entire New Deal with this brush. So this game developed, which has been replicated year after year, decade after decade, of finding some extreme piece of literature or a scene in a movie or a photograph and waving it around and using it to attack a bigger government target. And it was a very sad moment in American history because for a few years we were attempting to launch a real nationwide system of arts funding, and it was all brought down very quickly. You know, at the same time, you have to say that some of these federal theater projects were putting some rather extreme ideas out there, and at times the Roosevelt administration was actually funding a kind of propaganda for its own policies, which was an enormous mistake to make. So it was sort of we were talking about this earlier, Reed, but it was a complicated situation. But yeah, just this very, very sudden transformation, and artists were left stranded, stuck with their political views of the 1930s, which they may have continued to hold sincerely, in a totally transformed and fear-ridden political climate at the end of the 40s, going into the 50s. It was a shocking political transformation.
Right, when Russia becomes our enemy, and suddenly anybody who's even mildly associated with fellow travelers or who went to a meeting at Alva Bessie's house one afternoon, suddenly, as she said, the minute you get named, your career is over, your freedom is in danger. You could be imprisoned, you could be called in front of Congress and asked to ruin your friends' lives, ruin their families' lives by extension. And
the even more horrifying thing, I mean, as you're describing it, you're absolutely right. I can tell you as a filmmaker sitting up here, I feel self-conscious to be on a panel about this subject matter when I did not live through it. And it definitely brings home that the climate was very different. And we can sit up here and we can talk about the legacy of it, but there is no question that the climate must have been awful, and I cannot imagine not only having to fear being named, but having to fear being named by friends, by associates, by other artists with whom you would otherwise, I mean, as a filmmaker, there's no greater joy than being able to go over to a friend's house and watch the rough cut of their film and have a free discussion about their work and talk about the themes in it and give criticism and do it in a group in a setting over dinner, whatever you have this conversation. I can't imagine what that conversation would be like if you had to worry about that the next day that someone was going to turn around and say something that was then going to mean I could never make another movie again for the rest of my life. I just can't imagine what that would be like.
It developed into a kind of attack on anybody with a progressive view, anybody who wanted human rights, anybody who wanted anything, who wanted to make any change, to make a more just society. And to explain a little bit about what people were up against when they went before the committee, the first HUAC thing that happened in the late 40s, J. Parnell Thomas, the Hollywood 10, they all pleaded the First Amendment. And they said, well, you don't have the right, based on the First Amendment, to know anything about what what my personal beliefs are. But then when you came into the second one in the early 50s, the rules changed. And you could not admit you were a communist without naming names. You had no other option. And so if you did say, you got me, I'm a communist, I was a communist and here's why I'm not a communist now, then they'd say, you're in contempt of Congress if you don't tell us you're friends. And you could only take the fifth. If you took the fifth, then you wouldn't be in contempt of Congress. So they forced you to be in a situation,
but it was like saying you were guilty.
You know, where you had to take the fifth, which was like, oh, I'm not incriminating myself, so therefore I've committed some crime.
Exactly.
You know, which, you know, was just an incredibly Kafkaesque, horrible situation, and people behaved very badly.
And you read about cases where a witness would go up and say, okay, I will be a friendly witness, but I am not naming names. I will tell you about my own political background and affiliations, but I am not going to name names. And the committee would be, fine, no problem. This would be in sort of private session. And the minute they'd go into a public session, they would renege on that and immediately be like, by talking about yourself, you have, you know, given away the right to not talk about your friends, so you will name names or you will be in contempt of Congress. And this happened more than once.
Yeah, Lillian Hillman wrote a letter before her appearance that was extremely eloquent on this issue about, you know, as an American, I will not do this. I just cannot do it. It's not the way I was raised. And they said, well, they sent a letter back and said, you don't have the right to decide what kind of questions we're going to ask in how we're going to hold our hearing.
Go ahead.
What was the undoing of McCarthy and how did this era come to an end? I'm not really clear on that.
The question is, what was the undoing of McCarthy and how did this era come to an end?
It was the Joseph Welch.
Have you no sense of decency, sir?
Have you no sense of decency, sir? An Army, a lawyer, right?
Army Defense.
Yeah.
Army Defense lawyer, yeah.
An officer.
And one of the interviews I did for Trumbo was with a Broadway producer, Manny Eisenberg, who remembers being in school at that time, and classes would let out down at NYU. Everybody was watching that trial.
And another big thing is that was on TV.
Exactly,
So,
it was on
you know,
TV.
That didn't exist.
But
And
that
so
was
when people could actually see
it
that
was
kind of emotional.
It was
you know,
a very public undressing of McCarthy.
Have you no shame, sir? After all this time, have you no shame?
And McCarthy was essentially made a household name because TV was broadcasting this.
He didn't come across as well on TV. He
No.
was not so charismatic on TV, which isn't really very reassuring.
Like
because you think
Nixon.
if someone else had been playing the same role, who had
Yes,
a
you
very polished, you could think of some contemporary politicians who would play this role very well. He might have been able to snap back and sort of, you know, use that moment and you know, shout him down or say something clever and you know, survive that challenge.
I think you have to give credit to Edward R. Murrow as far as the downfall of McCarthy as well.
You're absolutely right.
I completely agree.
You know, I'm sorry, but you know, I'm just going to do it, and they did, and nothing happened.
And one of the things that happened, and this relates to Trumbo specifically, is that before 1960, when Exodus and Spartacus had Trumbo's name on it, some of these blacklisted writers began to win awards under their pseudonyms. And
That's right.
Dalton Trumbo, under the name Robert Rich won an Oscar, and nobody showed up to pick it up.
What was the film again?
It was The Brave One.
That's right.
It was a time when they gave Oscars for Best Story as well as Screenplay. And Robert Rich won an award for Best Story for The Brave One, and I forget who was giving the award, but she stood there with the award and nobody came up. Nobody claimed it. The next day, 6 Robert Riches appeared, all claiming to have written it. And Trumbo, who really was enjoying the battle to some extent at this point, started to use that, and he started to grant interviews as to, did he know who Robert Rich really was? And Trumbo said, I've adopted this policy that since the blacklist, I modestly refuse to either confirm or deny any picture that I, might be credited with. And this way I get a lot of credit for some films and never get blamed, as he said, for the scamps. And so it started to break down a little bit before 1960, but 1960 and beyond was the beginning of the end for the blacklist.
And what's happened since is a lot of these movies, like Trumbo wrote Roman Holiday, right? I mean, so a lot of these classic films they've given the blacklisted writers their names back, which is kind of nice.
We have time for one more question. Right back there.
If you get a chance, the essay that Elia wrote before the Crucible, it's like all about fear and hysteria and paranoia. And I happen to be a teacher, and I taught that essay, and it is fabulous. So if you ever get a chance to read it, I'd like to recommend it.
Here's an interesting footnote, is that Arthur Miller originally approached Aaron Copland about writing an opera based on The Crucible. Howard Pollack, the world's leading Copland authority, was originally to have been here and was unable to attend. Mentions this in his biography, and I was hoping he'd say more at the panel, because I know nothing about that project or why Copland turned it down. But Robert Ward's opera is a very strong one. Copland's The Tender Land, I think, is a beautiful piece, but doesn't necessarily indicate that Copland's greatest strength as a composer was in opera. But nonetheless, I mean, it's fascinating to think about how Copland might have dealt with the story, or perhaps whether he shied away from it because it struck too close to home, having been himself in front of the McCarthy Committee.
And we were talking about this actually prior to the panel. When The Crucible came out, I think it was 1953, the play was not a hit. It's now become part of the American theater canon, but when it came out, it was not considered a hit play. And 7 years later, Robert Ward makes an opera out of it, and it wins the Pulitzer. So it was the idea that, after a little bit of time, and somehow after this format has been slightly changed into an opera, which is, one would think, not quite as accessible necessarily a medium as the theater, and it suddenly becomes recognized as a major work on a major subject. You mentioned something about, this will be the last comment we'll take, you mentioned something about not addressing the fear of the bomb.
What do you think about this? Liberalizing socialistic programs was an early 20th century thing with PR. FDR was picking up PR's program, and nobody was worried about it. The conservative Republicans still struggled with the socialistic Democrats, but where it got the energy was, remember they used to show these movies of the air raid drills when the kids are getting under the desks or lining the halls? Well, that's us. I remember that, and that fear is what gave McCarthy the energy and made people listen and watch it on television, because it wasn't the politics. The politics had been around for the whole century. It was the fear of the bomb that it could all come to an end.
The duck and cover paranoia, that this is what he used to fuel it?
That's where the energy came from. The politics wasn't new.
Well, again, it's the idea of using fear to push your political agenda.
Or your power and your fame. And that's the first thing I had to say is, it never ends. There's always something to make people scared of. And politicians have used that, always, and probably always will, and it's a sad thing.
Thank you very, very much for coming today. Thanks a lot. And thank you, guys.